And when I was in fourth grade, I'll never forget my library system in the city that I lived in had just rolled out their first digital library catalog system. And I accidentally figured out that I could get into other people's library accounts and see what books they had and see their name and that kind of thing. Rush of adrenaline. I realized at that point, I was like, this is really cool. I figured out a missing piece to a puzzle. And it got that rush, and that stuck with me. I didn't know that you could turn that into something that you could do intentionally, or even better, turn it into a career, because that was it just really wasn't a thing that kids were taught or a door that was thought to be open. I would say have courage and don't give up. It has never been easier, and it might not feel that way, but it's never been easier to find the information and the people who can help you figure out how to make the transition that you're looking for.
Josh Yavor is the Chief Information Security Officer for human layer security company Tessian, where he leads information security, threat intelligence, and security research. Prior to this role, he served as a CISO for Cisco Secure and led cloud security for Duo Security, with earlier stops at Facebook, Oculus, and ISEC partners, which is where we met. Today we have Josh. Hi, Josh. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Eamon. Great to be here.
Glad to have you here today. It's a long time coming, and I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Absolutely. I've been excited for this one for weeks.
Let's start from the top. Tell us what you do today at Tessian.
Yeah, you gave a good intro there at a high level. Let me expand a little bit. I'm CISO at Tessian. Tessian is what we call a human layer security company. We are focused on delivering on what that means in email security. So our focus is on empowering users to do their best work day to day through the context of email without security getting in the way while still keeping them safe. So to us, that looks like providing real-time coaching, applying advanced techniques for human behavior analytics and that type of thing with machine learning, and really adding on to email security baked in capabilities that are in the cloud email providers. So it's a really exciting place to be in terms of product security space. And as part of my role, I have the privilege of leading the internal security team, but also through threat intelligence, and actually recently took on IT. I get to actually help enable the business from just a corporate and enterprise perspective through that IT function, as well as being able to really help influence and drive where we go with the product from a practitioner perspective internally. So that's more or less the full scope of my role here.
I'm glad you mentioned the IT portion. I'm actually starting to see a trend of IT coming under security. Can you walk us through how that has been? Do you recommend other companies doing that as well?
Yeah, I think there are many different permutations of what good looks like there, similar to there's no one single correct answer for where a CISO role should report, right? So what I have found is that fundamentally, effective security and effective IT programs are organically drawn to each other. And I think that's something that has perhaps become a more popular perspective over the last 10, 15 years, especially with shift to cloud and that type of thing. These functions are more deeply intertwined and less commonly seen as adversarial relationships. And I think that for me, especially being part of a cloud-first, cloud-native enterprise paired with a equally cloud-first and cloud-native product organization, it makes that pairing and that matchup organizationally much more organic. And so I think it's a growing, if not common, trend these days for IT and security to be one organization, especially at SaaS-based tech companies. But it's also a trend that I would actually encourage any type of organization to think about and explore, because even in the largest and most traditional institutions, oftentimes you have these shared responsibilities and partnerships. So I think a lot of people might be surprised by how many positive things happen when you really lean into that relationship and look at it through the organizational lens to figure out if that's the right fit for you.
Now, you've been a CISO at a security company before. What is it like to be a CISO at a security company versus a non-security company? Do you find it easier to do your job or harder? Or what's it like?
That's a great question. I think it's probably both easier and more difficult in different ways. It's definitely an additional level of responsibility, right? Because you have the traditional needs and requirements and accountability that comes with leading and building any internal security program. And all security product companies are still corporations themselves. They have similar goals that align to non-security products and similar. But for me, I really enjoy being in security product organizations because it lets me check a box from a impact perspective. that I don't get to check anywhere else. And specifically, I get to be not just a security leader inside of this product organization where all products have security as a critical component of what trust looks like for their customers, but I also get to be that internal buyer persona and have influence over what we're actually building and how we're thinking about things at a feature level tactically and strategically from a go-to-market perspective and a competitive perspective. And that's thrilling. I have learned so much more about just business in general over the last 5+ years, in particular, being at Duo, then Cisco, and then now here at Tessian. And that's just been thrilling. It's not easy day to day all the time. I would say that one of the challenges is getting the division of time and focus right. And that's really the challenge underneath it all, I think.
Do you find that there's higher expectations because you're at a security company?
There should be. And that's my somewhat snarky answer, but I do mean it. I think that when I step back and look at the history of security products, unfortunately, we don't all have a great track record. And I think that one trend that I like that is also challenging is that, especially with more and more organizations looking to solve for core security problems using SaaS-based solutions like Tessian, like a lot of the Cisco Secure portfolio and Duo where I was at, with that shift comes newer expectations around maturity, rigor, and completeness for those product security outcomes that those customers will care about. Yes, it is a bit more difficult. We should be under higher levels of scrutiny. That also shouldn't surprise us, because as security practitioners, we should be doing the same for our critical security controls that happen to live in the cloud in particular.
Yeah, just as long as you don't use bank level security in any of your material.
Right, or okay. Military grade encryption, or any of those buzzwords. Yes.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Great. So you alluded a little bit about, and I'd love to get into how you got into the role, but you alluded a little about the type of work and the pressure. And can you talk about the pressure it is as a CISO and what other CISOs are facing today in out there as far as burnout and missing time with family and those kind of things?
Absolutely. And as we get into my backstory, I'll give you a little bit of foreshadowing here, which is that everything I'm about to say, I think, is genuinely reflective of what we see and hear from other security leaders in the industry today. But I want to anchor this with me saying that this role that I have now, every security role I've ever had, pales in comparison in terms of the level of difficulty and effort necessary to be successful when I look back at where I got my start. So I want to start by saying that, and then we can talk more about that in a few minutes perhaps. But yeah, at Tessian, we've actually recently completed a bit of research where we surveyed a number of security leaders. And the trends were not surprising in terms of the themes around burnout, stress, and what the impact is. But I think what was potentially a little bit surprising on my end was just how high some of the data points were in terms of percentages of respondents who were impacted in different ways. So specifically, we talked to a population of security leaders and asked them to answer questions around how they've been impacted around stress, burnout, and what that impact is for them. And we saw data points like over 2 in 5 CISOs missing holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas due to work. Around the same amount have missed doctor's appointments in the past year. And like around a third are unable to do things like stay healthy through exercise. And I think one of the key things here is that it's easy to get lost in the superficial top level data. They're really important data points, don't get me wrong, but this is not a woe is us, feel bad for the CISO type of story. What my takeaway and what I think the broader takeaway from these types of findings really should be is if CISOs are experiencing this, and this is a more common trend perhaps, and perhaps influenced by things like the last couple of years of the pandemic, the Great Resignation, and all of that, what is this actually doing, and what does this reflect in terms of what their teams are experiencing? If the CISOs are going through this,
like a trickle-down effect, right?
Exactly. And I think there's the trickle down effect. And I would say maybe it's not even a trickle. That's my concern, right? Maybe it's a deluge or a downfall or downpour. And then there's also the risk to the business, right? If security leaders who are ultimately accountable for the operational security, health, and resiliency of an organization are barely able to keep themselves engaged in things that are critical to their health and safety, like getting to a doctor on a regular basis. What does that mean in terms of the grander risk profile of an organization? I think that's my takeaway from a lot of the research that we've done recently, and why I've been talking about burnout in particular, because I think there's a lot that CISOs can do to actually address this themselves.
Yeah, because as any manager, they need to shield their team from some of the chaos that's out there from the business and the pressures, right? But so if the CISO is not able to shield the team, that, yeah, I could see that really affecting the team and making it a really high pressure environment, right?
Yeah, and I think that you hit the nail on the head, because one of the traps I think that exists in security, and especially security leadership, is that we work in a industry where operational realities like incident response, like critical vulnerabilities like the Log4j or Log4j, however you say it, that happened back in December, those vulnerabilities. These are the things that get the spotlight. People perform heroics under duress. They're really cool. They're sexy stories. People love to hear and participate in these things because you get the adrenaline rush. This is the excitement, right? But it's too easy to let this become a norm, and for leaders to actually allow their organizations to operate under duress and require heroics as just part of the norm. And I think that right there is one of the first major inflection points that any CISO or security leader should be thinking about, is what is the actual day-to-day experience of especially the operational security folks who are aligned to their teams and functions. And if that looks like what we talked about in terms of impact and the life lived that CISOs are reporting, that's a huge problem, right? I don't know about you, but myself, if I had a choice between pressing the incident response button and knowing that we're going to need to pull an all-nighter or a full weekend of work, I'd rather start with a team that I know has a healthy balance between on-call, off-call, work, and life than one that's already burnt out and now I need more from them. That's a pretty easy choice in my mind.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. And these days, management teams are learning about emotional intelligence and the psychology and psyche of folks and burnout. We've identified the problem. What are some solutions that you would suggest out there?
Yeah, I think there's a few key themes. One is recognizing that this is not unique to security. We can't trick ourselves into believing that, horns in terms of finding this type of challenge.
We're not.
All right.
Yeah.
If we step back and we're like, hey, wait, who else is operational in a business context and has similar demands? How about the people who keep our .coms online, right? 24/7 operational response requirements are not unique or new to security. Security leaders and teams can actually look at other areas in perhaps even their own organization. If there are SRE functions or any parts of engineering or IT who need to be available 24/7 or respond to pages at least 24/7, what are they doing? How have they been successful? What have their failures been? And especially inside of larger organizations, what opportunities for alignment exist? I'm going to give you a story from Duo. One of the most impactful things that there in our security operations team was align the on-call expectations with our SRE partners in engineering. And by doing that, we made sure that we were being equitable across operational roles and providing similar employee experiences. I won't claim it was perfect, but it was much better than not doing anything. And it was also much better than having something that was a completely different experience. That's within the team. Outside of the team, I would really say that fundamentally, just as CISOs are expected and are accountable for helping organizations make risk-informed decisions effectively and in an eyes-wide-open manner, they should be no stranger to identifying the trade-offs, right? If we want to open up business in this new market, here are some of the security risks and threats and that type of thing that may come with that. We should be no strangers to that type of yes and type of approach to planning and getting things done. But oftentimes, I see CISOs and other security leaders stopping short of having that same kind of conversation around strategic work expectations, right? We'll overcommit We will have things like incident response come up or a major set of unplanned work. And what we won't do is we won't readjust the goalposts. We won't redefine success based off of the operational realities that our teams have encountered. And I think that's like a fundamental mistake that too many of us make. I'm imperfect. I think I've gotten better as I've realized these types of risks more directly. But I would point to that as the other fundamental area of improvement for CISOs, right? They should be working with their executive team partners. They should be working and thinking about this in terms of not just resourcing, but just basic expectation setting. You can't do everything that everybody wants of you. How do you make sure that what you are asking your team to do is actually achievable and achievable without heroics? And I think that's the key first step towards making this better for everyone.
Like setting boundaries.
Exactly. Yep. Boundary setting, but not just for the tactical things like who's on call and who's off call. Also things like, hey, in the next year, in the next 6 months, as we're working on the annual or quarterly or half-based planning at the executive level, how do you make sure that you're starting that expectation management at the top, literally, of the organization, so that security teams are not actually forced into these situations where heroics are necessary to actually deliver on the executive level commitments that have been made.
Yeah, it's a tough act. It's a tough act, and we're still evolving. Security as a function is young compared to many of the other functions out there. We need to learn from some of our other partner teams or analog teams in other companies and other organizations. So that's a deep topic, and thank you for sharing that. I want to shift gears now and get into how you got into the field. I think you have an interesting story, and I'd love to hear it. So I'm going to ask you the question, Josh. How did you get into information security?
I've been waiting to tell you this story for so long now.
I know.
Back when we were consulting together, I know we talked a little bit about it, but we never had time like this to really go a little bit deeper. Yeah, there are really two parts to my story. The first one is how I realized that this was even a thing that I was interested in. And that was accidental, honestly. I grew up in a family that was very aligned to the automotive industry. Both of my grandfathers owned auto repair shops in the Metro Detroit area. My father ended up taking on one of those shops, and that's how he met my mother. And I was the family disappointment in that I was not going to continue that trend. But it coming from this family that was focused on, hey, how do things work mechanically in complex machinery and that type of thing, and really seeing through the lens of like my father and my family business, how machinery and electronics work together, it made me inherently curious around especially how like the computers work. What is the role of a computer in an engine? That fascinated me. And when I was in 4th grade, I'll never forget, my library system in the city that I lived in had just rolled out their first digital library catalog system. And I accidentally figured out that I could get into other people's library accounts and see what books they had and see their name and that kind of thing. Rush of adrenaline. I realized like at that point, I was like, this is really cool. I figured out like a missing piece to a puzzle, and it got that rush, and that stuck with me. I didn't know that you could turn that into something that you could do intentionally, or even better, turn it into a career, because that was like, yeah, it just really wasn't a thing that kids were taught or a door that was thought to be open.
How did you discover that little 4th grade hack?
Oh, it's silly. The usernames were integers. And so semi-sequential, I don't remember all the details. And at the time, I didn't know then what I know now. But basically, it was you could guess with some level of reliability usernames. And there was, with that username, there was a way to actually get into basically, this is a very old system. And like we didn't have email hooked up to and that kind of thing. But you could basically trigger the equivalent of a password reset flow that would let you like, once you've identified a username, just reset and get in. And it was a total accident. I found it because I had typoed my own integer and I went through that flow and I got into somebody else's account. And once I realized what I had done, I was like, oh, wow, this is cool and also terrible. And yeah, I got out of there pretty quick because I was scared. Yeah. After that, I had that curiosity. That was fun. When I was getting out of high school, going into undergrad, some of the best influences in my life were from teachers. And I loved the concept of developing people. I was a swim coach for a long time, and I coached age group swimming. I got hooked on growing people in teams. and helping them get better, in that case, at swimming. And that's really cool because it's both an individual sport and a team sport at the same time. So you got both like the individual growth and development, as well as the team-based dynamics of how do you bring a bunch of individuals together to do some cool things together. And so that led me to prioritize education. So my first career was actually as a middle school social studies teacher on the west side of Michigan. And that
I could see you as a middle school teacher. Yeah, I could see
it was a great experience, very difficult. As I said a few minutes ago when I was foreshadowing this part of the conversation, incredibly challenging job. And teaching's a really challenging field to be in anywhere in the world, but especially in different parts of the US. And I think that some of the key things that I learned from being a teacher are actually the things that make me more successful, I think, today, which is, fundamentally, I could argue that teaching is social engineering. I had students who were 11 and 12 years old, right? I had to convince them that it was in their best interest to do anything on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And unlike today, as somebody who leads teams and functions, when I was a teacher, I had to do that with no authority. I had to influence without authority. I had no performance management interactions with students. The worst thing I could do really was give them a bad grade or call home, or worse, call their grandmothers. And I think that what that forced me to learn was actually what became good management skills. And that's something I didn't realize until years into my time in tech and security, how valuable that experience was in translating what I now know to be just like the fundamentals of good professional development for teams, and really just learning to tailor engagement to employees in a business context. That's a very common thing for teachers to do, but a lot of folks don't realize that a lot of the strategies that teachers bring to bear in the classroom to drive engagement, to drive growth and success across a diverse set of learners are highly applicable and transportable over to leading and developing teams in the private sector, in businesses, and so on.
Yeah. Shout out to all our teachers out there. Teaching is not easy. A lot of people realize that when we had to shut down in the pandemic and parents had to become teachers. A shout out to all our teachers out there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So now you're a middle school teacher. How does that get you into security? That's interesting.
Yeah, so along the way, I couldn't shake that tech itch. In undergrad, as I was going to school, I also wanted to make some income on the side. So it started with something that a lot of people did at the time, which was if you knew how to repair or build a PC or something like that, you might make a few bucks off of that. I remember, and I think it's been long enough where I won't get in trouble for this, but I remember bartering for MP3 collections. I'll replace your hard drive in your gaming computer for some music and things like that. But eventually I found that whether it was PC repair or doing new gaming machine builds, I could make a decent bit of cash on the side. That grew into building websites for people. So I did some sites for graphic artists and that type of thing. And eventually I got into teaching and I kept my business going. It was a nice thing about having predictable time off as a teacher. I could really focus on project work in the summers and over winter break and be able to get a nice little bit of side income going. That culminated with me operating e-commerce sites and doing things like remote desktop management for Windows fleets for a small business. And I didn't really know it at the time because, again, this was just a way for me to scratch an itch around tech curiosity, put a little bit more cash in my pocket on the side as well. But ultimately, I had gotten enough experience in, I guess, what you would call full stack Linux and web app management and development, as well as endpoint management and configuration. Had my first encounters with PCI compliance because I had to figure out how to make sure that my flagship customer in particular could process credit cards. And that gave me enough of a foundation that by the time I had to go and get a master's degree, which at least in the state of Michigan at the time, and I believe this is still true, in order to actually level up in the pay bands in particular for public teacher compensation, you needed to continue your education. I was lucky enough to be able to get into a master's program that my district would help pay for. And I would also be able to use to open up additional doors. And so I actually got my master's degree in information security. And it turns out that what I learned there was useful, not anything compared to the first few years of being a consultant or in security, of course, but it was enough to give me both the experience that I mentioned a moment ago, plus the accreditation that came with that degree. That was the key thing that allowed me to pivot from being a teacher to getting a foot in the door in tech and in security in particular.
Okay, so they actually had, and do you, that master's degree in information security, so during that time when you took it, your intention was to go back to teaching to level up, but then I'm guessing you realized somewhere in there that, you know what, there's a whole other career out there. So at what point did you make a decision to get out there?
Great question. So I had gotten about 5 years into teaching. My wife and I, we had just had our first child at the end of one of the school years. And I was on track to complete my master's, I believe that December, if I recall correctly. So I had not completed it yet, but I was close. And my intention was to stay teaching. I don't think I ever intended to be a full 30-year plus career teacher. I was going to do something different at some point. I just didn't intend to as soon as I did. But I think the catalyst that made me really look for a change was that I had been deeply interested in applying technology in education. And I'd been given a role at the district level in the school district that I taught in to actually do just that. So I was going to be an educational tech, I forget the title, but I was going to help teachers with using and applying different types of technology to enhance their student experience, to make things easier for them, and just make classroom technology integration delightful for everyone. And unfortunately, I'll never forget this. I think it was like the first Saturday after we brought my first kid home from the hospital, I got a phone call from HR. It was like, hey, saw the photos of your child. She's adorable. That's great. Calling with some bad news. We had some changes and we have to that role doesn't really exist the way that it did. And we were going to need to put you back into the classroom where you were. And that wow. was it. It's not that I wasn't deeply upset or anything like that. Things like that happen, but it was like the unexpected kick that I needed while I had the time to go and start really thinking and reflecting on what I wanted to do. We had just gotten into summer break, and that was the catalyst that really made me start thinking, okay, what else can I be looking at? What other options should I explore before I go back to the classroom in the fall? And that led me on the journey that brought me out of teaching and out to California to start my security consulting career.
Okay. Yeah, you had a perfect storm there. You had a life change. You had a lot of extra time this summer, and you had someone who a door closed on you at some point. And so all that together, you know what? It's going to facilitate some sort of change, as opposed to, say, happening midway through your school year and you're stuck and you're in the weeds of things.
Exactly. Yep. I think if it had happened in a few, if a few different things were, if a few small things were different in terms of timing and the way that the sequence of events happened, who knows? I could still be in the classroom today. And that's a wild thing to think about. But yeah, it happened and here we are.
Yeah. So tell me about now, we have this individual, you're technically a teacher at this point. You haven't finished your master's. You do have some tech skills. But how was searching for a job? How is that job search now trying to find, did you know you wanted to get into tech, did you know you wanted to get into information security or just tech in general? Walk us through that job search that summer.
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to get into information security. And what I didn't know was all the things I learned later on around all the different ways to get in, what that meant in different industries, what all the roles were. But a few things happened. I did a spray and pray type of application approach. I think I applied to probably 60 to 100 different roles over that summer. And they ranged from one-person IT and security type of jobs for like small businesses that are like mom and pop shops, all the way to applying for like big tech organizations and really just hoping that somehow I would sneak in. That didn't work out. But I ended up getting through a few different interview loops. And honestly, like if there's one thing that I would go back and point to and tell anyone to emphasize early in any type of career pivot like this that they were trying to make, is don't look at these types of applications and the candidate experiences as pass-fail, to use a teaching term. These are ways to actually practice and get better and build your own knowledge and capabilities to then land a future job and pull off these types of career transitions. I really benefited by having a number of even just first touch screening calls and learning what it was that companies were looking for and really honing my messaging. I got into some first round, like after the screen, like first real like technical interviews. I learned a lot about what I didn't know about Linux and certain parts of security. And that gave me data points that I could then go back and research and build my story and skills on. And ultimately, I had two options. I had a consulting role that was potentially available as a entry-level associate, or I forget what we called it, but it was basically the ground floor of consulting. And I had another similar role that was potentially there, which was going to be a security operations center analyst, junior level, basically, and especially in this era, it was still like eyes on screen looking at packets, basically, in Wireshark or similar. And between those two, I didn't know what to do. And I could have, in retrospect, I could have seen myself going either direction. But there was something about the idea of being a consultant and like helping people and being part of teams that help people that really actually made me latch onto that one first. And I'm so glad I did, because that's how I ended up at ISEC Partners, moving out to California. And really, it was the time I spent at ISEC, and especially my first year there, that's where I was able to learn and experience enough to then set me on track for changing over, getting out of consulting, getting into like internal security teams and growing from there. That the more distance I have in my personal timeline from that first job, the more I recognize the value of one, being able to be inside of a consultancy like that, because that was such a delightfully unique experience. But also the level of learning opportunity that existed there, I don't think you can really find anywhere else. So it was such an accelerant to my career. Had I taken the other route, which I think is totally viable, I may have grown quickly, but I don't think that, especially in that first year, I would have been able to accelerate my career as much as I was able to if I had gone with the other role that was potentially available.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've said it before on the podcast, but taking a consulting role, if you have the time or family situation or whatever it may be, a consulting role, you learn 2 years worth of experience for every year you work there, as opposed to being outside. So you definitely get thrown into it, and you're just exposed to so many different environments and companies. Taking a consulting role is definitely a really good way to accelerate one's career. It does have its burnouts, but yeah, it is a good accelerant.
Absolutely. And I would say that the secret that I learned was that because it was just like grading papers, I could actually review the status reports and the final reports that we were generating out of our office. And so that is how I actually spent my first 30 to 60 days, was volunteering for every single peer review opportunity for any type of document that was going to be put in front of a customer that was coming out of our office in San Francisco. And I got to see the best of the best in terms of the team that was at ISEC and people who were deep, multi-decade subject matter experts in their domains put together content that, sure, I would catch like typos and have wordsmithing contributions initially, but I would be able to learn not just more about the vulnerabilities they were finding, the opportunities for improvement for the products and the organizations they were helping, but I was able to also learn how did they apply methodologies to actually identify vulnerabilities? How did they contextualize the risks that they were discovering in the context of the larger business and the customers that business may have? those were those key points that, again, I never would have predicted. That's where I would learn most of the technical things and the organizational, like risk management fundamentals that I would then need to be successful in my next steps in my career. But really, it was, again, the first couple months in consulting, reading and engaging in every report that really was, I think, some of the best decisions that I've made in my career.
Yeah. Taking that, I think I remember you telling me that, taking that opportunity, you volunteered. What that means is you took the initiative, right? You're here at this place. You didn't have to volunteer and read those papers, but you took a shortcut. You saw a shortcut and took it in. And that's a level of grit that you need when you're trying to get into a new field, right? Just take any avenue you can get, take anything you can get. Yeah, I commend you for that. Like, it's similar to actually my first guest was at a pen test company. He had the opportunity he was internal to the organization, and Dan Borges, and he was able to see the pen test papers that everybody was producing and learned pen testing from that. It's really exciting to hear that you did that as well. That's really exciting. One thing I want to ask you is, though, can you walk us through the interview experience? So ISAC did have a decent technical interview. Coming from a teaching background, you had some Linux and endpoint protection, endpoint management experience from your side gigs. How did you prepare for the technical interview there?
Yeah, I did a number of things. I bought a few different books. I'm trying to remember what they were. One of them was the Web Application Hacker's Handbook. I probably also got the database version. I think it's the same name, if I recall correctly. I think I got McNabb's book, Network Security Assessments or something like that, which was hilarious because I didn't even know this at the time, that we would cross paths at ISAC, and then I would have the realization that one of the books I bought to try to get this job in consulting was written by a person we'd end up working with. That was amazing. So
surreal. That's actually that's the first book I actually read when I was trying to get into security as well, get a real security engineering job. Yeah. And so when I realized that this guy, years later, I'm at an organization that employs this person, the author, I'm like, wow.
Yeah, it was so really surreal. Cool. Yeah, so I got those books. I tried them out. By trying them out, I read them cover to cover a few times, and then I tried to get hands-on practice. So I think whether it was all the GOAT apps were what we called them once we got into consulting, but basically the intentionally vulnerable web apps with exercises and that kind of thing. I played with a few of the open source or free trial like web proxy tools as well, things like Burp or Zap and things like that. And that gave me enough to get it to cover like web application security. That was a key thing that I knew I needed. I already felt okay in network security fundamentals because that's most of what I had been focused on in my master's program. It was like Cisco routers and switches, getting that right, VPNs, network segmentation, all that good stuff, ports and firewalls, good stuff. But where I was weak, and this showed up in the interview, I'll never forget this, but I'm in the interview and talking through all the stuff I felt good about. That was great. Got to cover network security stuff with one person, got to cover web application security with a few other people. And then Alex Stamos walks in, and they were rotating through different interviewers. Alex comes in and starts grilling me on native application like memory handling, and like I'm sitting there in front of a whiteboard, and this is an area I know like nothing about. I knew what C and C++ were. I had written some code. I think I had a class on like in high school that included some of that, but memory corruption and like even how to draw and talk about a stack, these are all like foreign concepts to me. And I'm sitting there trying my best to even understand what he was asking me to tell him about. And I think this is one of the things that I think that I demonstrated that helped me maybe not get the job, but not be disqualified. And that was, I didn't pretend to know what I was doing. It was very clear. That ship had already sailed anyways. But I think being able to say, I don't know this very well. This is what I understand. I can work through this. Can you help me like diagram this? Can you help me better understand? And I'll go as far as I can. And I think really it was, let me admit, that was not the only time I had to do that in that interview. To be honest, I definitely hit all of my technical edges, and credit to the team that was interviewing me for getting all those. But I think it was applying that willingness and drive to learn, and not just learn later on, but learn in the moment, and then demonstrating that capacity to have a educated conversation around things you don't know, explore new material, and then be able to show analytical skills and conclusions that can be drawn from that learning. I just described consulting, and I didn't know that at the time, but I think that was the saving grace of that experience. Was I had enough technical foundation to carry me through, but most importantly, again, in retrospect, I did not really appreciate this at the time. I think in retrospect, it was those consulting characteristics that would be necessary for in the future when I got dropped into things that were engagements that were supposed to be one thing. One time I did a web application penetration test that actually ended up being native code. And I had to learn on the job because that's not what we had staffed for, but it was too late to change it. And it was that type of skill set that helped us as consultants really be able to roll with the punches and still deliver successful outcomes for our clients.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can benefit from that experience and that advice. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. Cool. That's really exciting. So thank you for sharing that. And I think it was turtles all the way after that. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, it was turtles all the way. I think consulting was such a great experience. I loved it. We talked about burnout earlier on. I actually got burnt out as a consultant. I didn't another one of those things where I didn't realize it until like it was too late. But what I realized I got burnt out on was I had this disappointment because I had many repeat clients that I kept going back to where at the end of 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever the engagement was, ultimately you'd give somebody a very expensive PDF report and you'd hope that they do something with it. And the number of times that I went back or had a follow-up conversation and progress just wasn't made. And it wasn't because of the people that we worked with. It was just the organizational realities that were stopping them from making more effective progress. That began to frustrate me, and eventually had opportunities come up that were outside of consulting. And that was the thing that really motivated me to make that change and get out of consulting was, hey, what if I was on the other side? What if I actually had the opportunity to move that needle further? Let's give that a try. And so I did. And that's how I ended up staying in security outside of consulting and getting to where I am today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, it is a very frustrating aspect when you come back and things aren't fixed. So it kills you over there, just demeaning a little bit, or I'm not sure what the right word is. But so as a CISO, or even before as a security manager, do you have any tips you can share for things that you look for when hiring security folks, whether they're senior or entry level? I'm sure you're not, I don't know if you interview analysts still or you're in the loops or not, but what can you share from things that you're looking for and advice for those out there trying to get into the field?
Yeah, I think first, I prioritize being invested in this area for all of my teams, regardless of size. My last team was around 50, so a pretty sizable team. And no, I couldn't be in every single interview loop at that scale. But whether it was that size team or the 5 or 10 that I've had in different organizations, being directly or indirectly involved has always been a priority. And the reason for that is because this is one of the most critical things to get right, of course. Who you hire and the team that you build is so critically important to get right. And we know from looking at the industry, we're not doing this right as an industry. We have what we are perceiving as a skills shortage. And while I believe that some of that is true, I think two things are true at the same time. One is that the skills shortage that exists, especially at the mid and senior level of talent, is largely self-inflicted because we have not delivered on growing people in our industry in the way that we should. We've put people into career paths in many organizations where they can't grow into mid and senior level roles in the timelines that we need them to, or they do grow, and worse, we don't recognize them. We don't promote them. We don't elevate them up, and that's on us, and we need to learn from that. The second thing that I think is equally true is that we have not done a good job as a security industry of opening up our doors and actually drawing in and being willing to hire candidates, honestly, like I was, right? People who didn't go to school formally, get a bachelor's degree in computer science, or go and get their start in a tech company and things like that. So exactly, I think we need to be more willing as hiring managers to take a chance on people based off of their behaviors Do they fundamentally have a curiosity and a bias towards action in learning and engaging with you and your team? And can you teach them what you need to? And here's the thing that I challenge a lot of people on when I have these conversations around hiring, especially at the entry level, but also at the mid and senior level too. What's a safer bet? Is it hiring somebody now who you feel good about, who would be a good partner and team member for the rest of your team, is somebody who can communicate effectively, who can learn rapidly based off of what you've experienced in the interview, but might not check all the boxes in especially the chronological time experience requirements or something else? Is it better to take a risk on hiring them and bringing them on board in a few weeks? Or are you going to let that job rec stay open for the next 90 days, 180 days? Which is the bigger impact to your business? The cost of actually training somebody who's close up, or leaving something open, capacity unmet, or capacity needs unmet, to hope that you're going to find somebody who checks every single one of your boxes? What I'm not saying is lower the bar, right? I think we can still have the same definition of successful outcomes for the person that we want in the role. But if we say that we want to actually deliver these hiring-based requirements in a reasonable amount of time and actually set people up for success, we have to be willing to bring people in and actually grow them into what we need them to be, rather than just waiting and hoping that somebody shows up on our doorstep with everything that we're looking and hoping for.
Yeah. And even when they show up, like, they might not stay for long. Right. Investing in them, like any investment, it's going to pay off dividends later. We have to identify what's trainable, what can someone teach or be taught, and then what's not teachable, right? So
exactly. And the key thing that I highlight on that question is you can always teach people technical skills and like content knowledge and context around a business, a programming language, a tech stack, whatever it is. What is really difficult to teach people is how to actually collaborate and work well with others, and to not be a jerk. And so I think between those two risks that hiring managers have to look at, you usually have much more confidence that you can level up somebody from a context or a technical skill perspective than you can when trying to hire somebody who actually checks all your boxes on and then some on like the technical side, but you're worried about them potentially being like toxic to your team or not really being able to serve your internal or external customers and clients effectively.
Yeah, interesting points. I want to ask a couple more questions, but I think we're at time.
Yeah, I can keep going if you want to. I just looked at my calendar and the next one can be pushed.
Okay, yeah, just curious. Do we have a jerk problem in the security industry? Do we have a problem? Is it because like unicorns, like you've hired a lot of people, you've worked with a lot of people. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that we have a jerk problem. I think that there are at least nothing that's like specific or unique to InfoSec in particular.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Is it specific? I'm asking like a little edgy of a question, just putting it out there. But do we have a problem in InfoSec because we feel like we have all this power and we're so sought after? Does that make us jerks, or does that make some people jerks? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think like the way I think about this, because you're right, you're not the first to ask this question, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it is something that people have to think about. For me, where my thinking has led me is to acknowledge that our industry, because of those constraints we just talked about, especially in hiring and also retaining and growing people, we are at higher risk of tolerating behaviors that we probably shouldn't, because we're afraid of losing talent and capacity in our teams. So I wouldn't proclaim paint a broad swath here that like, yeah, we have a problem with like people who don't behave professionally in InfoSec positions. I don't think that's necessarily fair, but I do think that because of the talent acquisition and management challenges that our industry has, as managers, not just as hiring managers, but people who manage existing teams and people who are in seat, we have to be mindful of what we're tolerating to exist and be true in our teams. Because there's that famous quote, who was it? It was Peter Drucker, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast or something like that. Culture is so important for teams and the organizations that those teams support that the other thing, I wish I had the attribution for this quote, but I apologize, I can never remember. the thing I always come back to in terms of culture, because again, it is so important, is that culture is not what you aspire to be. It's not what you say your core values are on paper. It's not what your recruiting page on your website says. Culture that your team and company experiences is driven by what you allow to be tolerable in the organization. So you can say that you are kinder than necessary, like we did at Duo. You could say that you're human first, as we are at Tessian. And that's great. We should say those things. We should be aspirational. We should want that to be true. But what culture actually is and what we're accountable for is what we allow our employee and like customer and internal experiences to be. Again, in terms of the behaviors and experiences that we allow to exist.
I love it. I'm going to let that soak in for a little bit. That's great. Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. I think I lost my train of thought there. I'm going to pause for a second. Yeah, that's, no, you're right. Cool. Let me see. Is there anything else you want to talk about? This won't be, this part I'll cut out.
Okay. Yeah. No, we've covered a lot. I'm feeling pretty good. Is there any part that like, you don't feel good about in terms of like length or anything you want to redo?
No, it's all good. It's all good. We're at a perfect length. And there was one I thought I wrote it down, but no, I didn't. Yeah, I think I got everything. I take copious notes while during this. Shoot, there was one thing that you touched upon right now that kind of caught me off guard. Culture. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So I'll ask one more question. So
sure.
So Josh, any parting thoughts to those out there looking to get into the field?
Yeah, I would say have courage and don't give up. It has never been easier, and it might not feel that way, but it's never been easier to find the information and the people who can help you figure out how to make the transition that you're looking for. And I mean that both in terms of getting into security, but also once you're into a first role or second or third role in security, it is such a broad and diverse set of different types of roles and experiences. And oftentimes people think that they're artificially constrained within their growth and how transferable their skills are into maybe other markets or other types of security roles. I would encourage people to not let those perceptions slow them down. So like the key things I would point to is that it's never been easier to find open source and freely available technical trainings and like CTFs or tools. That's never been more accessible than it is today. And that's easy to point to. The harder things I would point to and the more difficult to sometimes engage with are things like considering going to something like a career transition bootcamp. There's a few of those. You have to be careful in what you select, but I've actually hired people out of programs like Hackbright, which and that was a very successful experience in terms of being able to actually find people who are making career transitions who, going back to what we were talking about in the key qualities in interviewing, that obviously have demonstrated the passion, the investment, the commitment and capability to learn in a short period of time, and then to be able to demonstrate that. Those are very cool programs. If you can find a good one that's within reach, whether that's time commitments, affordability, geographical constraints, all of that. And I would also say engaging in the community is something that's really important. And that doesn't mean that you have to go and attend security conferences. It doesn't mean that you have to be like somebody with tens of thousands of followers on Twitter or something like that. But start talking to people or listening to people at the very least. So find people who are in roles in social media or in, I don't know what to call LinkedIn. Is that social media? I guess like work social media, something, right? But find people who are in roles that you find interesting. And follow them, listen to them, talk to them. Many people will talk, and it's just that people don't reach out and ask for conversations and stuff. And I guess like maybe my final thought here is that the last thing I would encourage is really just, and I'm pausing here and laughing internally because I had a very embarrassing moment when I was managing some people on my team at Duo where I told them this. And they thought that I was telling them that they needed to find a new job. And that was not that's not the message I was trying to get across at all. And I had to correct myself. We fixed that. But I'm actually a big advocate for my own teams, even of people to prioritize looking at job postings at many other companies, whether that's on LinkedIn Jobs or any of the actual like company sites or other job boards. Because here's what happens. If you pay attention to those, you figure out what roles exist. You figure out what roles exist in which parts of industries and markets and at what types of companies. And you learn over time, what is more and less attractive to you in terms of what that work sounds like and looks like and more of the details about it. And you also get a sense of what what's consistent around the job expectations or requirements. And that is such a useful exercise that people, once they have a initial role in security, too often stop doing. They'll hope for something to happen magically for them rather than going out and trying to look for things. And I lied. I've got one last thing, which is, and this is incredibly important for folks, especially as they're making a career transition, and especially through a diversity and inclusion lens. Don't hesitate to apply for jobs that you think you've got a shot at. If you feel like you would be great at a role if you were just given a chance and you're looking at the job requirements that the employer is expecting and you're like, hey, I only need a few of these. If you're at like 10, 15, 25% confidence on your end, go for it. The worst thing you're going to hear is no. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to have a conversation, you get stumped, and it doesn't go anywhere. But try, because more often than not, those requirements are not as fixed as they appear to be, and just don't hesitate. Put yourself out there, engage, and like I said earlier, that alone is worth its weight in gold in terms of the practice and experience that you're able to build as a candidate who's being considered for those roles.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, put yourself out there. You have nothing to lose. Sometimes they're only looking for 2-3 bullet points out of that whole like bucket list of things. Yeah, just get out there. That's great advice, Josh. Thank you so much for joining today and sharing your experience and tips and everything like that. This has been a wonderful experience on my end. And yeah, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. It's been great catching up, and good to see you again, Eamon.
All right, same here. Thanks a lot.